Hello, this is another political video. This is in reference to the Kyle Kashuv situation. This is basically going to be my take on it. Now, I want to open up by saying that I don't like political correctness generally, basically because I've never really lived by it, so naturally this situation has some implications on that. I've taken a look at what actually happened, his whole drama with Harvard and his defense, and the things that he said. Among the things that he said, the only thing that he said, there was 3 messages that I saw. I don't know if there was more messages. There's the first message where he said the N-word 15 times. There's the second message where he talked about making a CSGO map of the school and shooting, kill all the Jews. And then there's the third message, which I don't remember what the third message was, but it also used the N-word in some capacity. Now, my immediate reaction is the second message is the only one that's the first and third message don't matter. The second message is the only one that's even somewhat contentious, but it also isn't contentious when you consider that he didn't actually end up doing anything. Hence, my general position is that this whole thing should have pretty much been ignored. Not necessarily from Harvard's side, but from the general public side. And this is where things like this get super complicated, because you have Harvard, and I was arguing with 2 of my social justice-y friends about this, and one of them was saying how, well, the thing about Harvard is that the position on that end is that they are super selective, yada yada, people are super competitive, so they want to have their star, a shining star student who's perfect, and any blemish on their character can be used against them, pretty much. Now, that standard that they have is probably stupid, because it's based off of something that's perceptional, but, so I implicitly don't agree with it, although, frankly, my irritation in this whole situation doesn't have anything to do with Harvard. I'm less pissed off at Harvard and more pissed off at just, the way that this is being interpreted and branded, which part of which is probably, implicates Harvard as well. But yeah, whatever. They have some standard, and they've done this kind of thing before, and I read an article when they've, rescinded applications before. Who cares? I mean, sorry, it's not that who cares. They're a bureaucratic entity. They have to make bureaucratic moves. The thing is, what pisses me off isn't so much that Harvard works in the way that it does. What pisses me off is the internal logic that's being used to justify this type of thing. Because Harvard's policies, they get to basically discriminate on moral character. They get to rescind an application based off of moral character. And when I hear that, my immediate reaction is, what the fuck can you glean in terms of moral character from those tweets? And I think that's the actual argument. Looking at everything that's going on Twitter and online and the general media reaction to this, it does seem like people actually think that this does indicate something about a person's moral character. And my position is, it basically doesn't. It could indicate a million different things, but moral character by itself like that, you shouldn't even begin to go there. Not on the internet, not like this. So yeah, let's get into, this is what he did this whole apology thing on Fox News, and on Fox News, the Fox News anchor asks him, and it's this weird beady eye moment, why would you say that word 15 times? As if every additional use of the word adds negative utils to the value equation or something. It seems so ridiculous. You're already talking about a comment that is happening in some fucking pocket dimension of cyberspace, and the implications that has for the greater world because you happen to find out about it. And it didn't affect anything because it happened 2 years ago, and it's clearly just sprung out of nowhere now while the guy's applying to college. What? What? Actually, maybe he didn't. Actually, I don't know if that last part is true. If he only applied to college 2 years later, I'm assuming he did, and he isn't just some brilliant student who applied right after making these messages. Nonetheless, it's the way that the media is reacting to it is like this is some cardinal sin that's been committed here that we need to now attend to it and analyze it like it's an actual moral issue. That's what pisses me off, right? You want to talk about moral character. This is not how you even begin to talk about moral character. Then you had like the Young Turks, as usual, they do their thing. To their credit, Cenk Uygur was actually saying how the kid shouldn't have had his thing rescinded, which is fair, credits to him. But the point I'm still making is that even there, the problem is I can still tell that the way they conceive of this is playing into their assessment of moral character here. And what I'm suggesting is that moral character shouldn't even be in this equation because you don't know anything about moral character in this particular situation. You don't have enough to start speculating about moral character because everything he did is still well below the baseline level of action that someone would need to do for moral character to come into the picture. Moreover, that moral character is not even something you can glean from individual actions. Moral character is something you get out of, prolonged experience, both public and private. One of my social justice friends said that, well, we don't know anything about moral character, so we go off of what we know. And I'm like, what does that mean? We go off of what we know. So you're ascribing a character to it that isn't necessarily there because you don't actually know what his real moral character is. That's not okay. I'm going to admit that I have personal stake in this because I also do, I enjoy my offensive humor. I enjoy my shock value as well. And I'm immature. That shouldn't, I'm laying that on the table, though, because I'm saying that should be on the table. At the very least, that shouldn't be grounds for expulsion or rescission or excision or tampering from some institutional, power structure that has the ability to write these things off without research or knowledge or anything. For fuck's sake, I don't actually believe that Harvard actually understands moral character when they analyze it in those interviews. That's me just being like I don't know anything about what they do. I'm just going to assume that they don't because I assume that most people don't know how moral character works. I don't think you can get moral character from a person from an interview. I don't think you can get moral character from a person from some basic exposure or an essay or a college thing or anything like that. That's not how it works, right? Moral character is far deeper than that. So you need to have higher standards for how to apply it. Then there's one thing, okay, so just a brief aside that I want to mention. Everyone brings up the fact that this kid, in his defense, he brought up the fact that he was 16 years old, he made this mistake. 16 years old, made this mistake. I don't like that framing of it as well because it implies there's some kind of age dependency with regards to making those kinds of statements, which there really shouldn't be. It suggests this standard where, oh no, he said it when he's 16, the implication being that when he's older, he learns not to say those things and would never say those things. And I think that's bullshit. It doesn't matter if he's 16, if he's 18, if he's 25, if he's 30. He can be an immature adult and say those things. And it still shouldn't be grounds for doing any of what's been done here. It shouldn't be grounds for reacting to it the way that people are reacting to it. Because that standard is actually wrong. You don't have to become mature once you... we might want people to be more mature. It might be generally good on an individual level for people to be mature. But to suggest that maturity has strict implications on how you're supposed to use language on the internet to this degree seems ridiculous. It seems hegemonic. It's it's oh, okay, you can make the mistake, but the assumption is eventually you learn not to make the mistake and change. It's no, you don't have to. You can stay, you can continue saying ridiculous things on the internet. It doesn't matter how ridiculous they are, because sometimes people just want to be ridiculous. It doesn't, there is no reason to think that you can't apply the standard to every single person out there and find moments where they've been immature, or they've been petty, or they've been weak, or they've been sad, or they've been stupid, or they've been disgusting, and use it against them. And that's the precedent that's at stake here. So that's what this really is about. It's not about racism or anti-racism in my mind. It's about, it's about informational exposure. It's about complete informational exposure, including the dark side of what human beings can do, and somehow using that against them, and thus enforcing some kind of like Platonic standard of we have to appear clean and lovely and compassionate in public, in the public eye, which is, I'm all for the idea of that there is a Platonic standard, but it's a bullshit standard because I don't believe anyone actually works like that, right? Not in a perceptual sense. That's the real problem here, is it's perception versus reality compared to, you want the reality of someone who's like platonically, a good person versus the perception of that. And what this is creating and enforcing is the perception of that rather than the reality of that. Then there's the whole argument about private versus public. People will argue that, well, Harvard's a private institution, so it's not a free speech thing. I want to get away from this general arguments about rights, like as the foundations for these kinds of ethical things, or free speech. Because it doesn't make any sense when we're talking about a system that's so complicated to think about it in terms of, well, there's the government and then there's everything else. That's not how it works. I mean, free speech is a completely different animal depending on what level of informational exposure you have in the system, right? If you were saying the N-word to people you knew and they didn't want to hang out with you, that's one thing. If you're saying it to your girlfriend or your friend or your family or people you knew, that's one thing. That's understandable. Or it's a low-scale, small business thing. That's private. But as you start climbing up, you get into like large institutions that are like embedded in society. That's a completely different thing because they're actually embedded in society. They have to discriminate a lot less than you can discriminate at the local level. You have no responsibility when you discriminate at the local level. Because when you discriminate based on these kinds of things at the local level, you're just affecting your own life, well, the other person's life, but you're basically affecting your own life. Institutions, they have power, so it's a completely different ballgame. It's different when we're talking about small businesses versus large businesses as well, and it's certainly different when we're talking about small businesses versus, hospitals or banks or schools or financial institutions or internet platforms, right? All of those things are different. They're a completely different tier of all of this. And they should be held to a much higher standard when it comes to, free passes when it comes to bad speech, because otherwise this is going to become, this already is hegemonic. But the point is that, like, the division between private and public really has to have some kind of, like, what you can do in private versus what you can do in public has to have some sort of gradient, like some sort of gradient allowance depending on how embedded the institution is within society. Which is why Harvard is not that embedded, but it is a school, and it becomes more embedded when you consider the fact that the left also wants to make it a public institution, right? To make it a free institution. It would still be competitive in that regard. It's free, free college. It would still be competitive and private in its selection, but nonetheless, this becomes a giant issue on that level because institutions on that level should really discriminate less. If you imagine how much work that this kid probably put into trying to get into Harvard, there's not enough reason from those messages to assume he wouldn't have succeeded at Harvard and he wouldn't have been able to add value to the society as a result. So this decision, while it probably also gives similar opportunities to some student who's equivalently talented, what you're using as a basis to take away his rights to pursue his own life or whatever, that is, it's not good enough. It's just not high. It's not proportional to the punishment here. That's what it is. Like, if it's a completely, and again, it's Harvard. You're not going. Harvard is not like a privately led train where everything has a particular purpose. People go to a school to pursue their own lives, right? It's an institution that's built for people to pursue their own lives. The idea that you can't have bad shit that you say privately or on the internet used like out there, and the fact that there's people who literally say, well, you shouldn't say those things. Not that they shouldn't be used against you. No, you shouldn't say them. Right? You shouldn't ever say anything bad. It should just not be used against you. But here's the other thing, and I guess this makes me a little unpopular, but I actually do think that you should be able to say things that are bad on the internet under certain conditions, right? And this is where I guess we get into like the whole. This is where we get into the whole question of like the ethics of language. Should you be able to say bad things, right? You could say, well, hold on, you're exaggerating. There's a difference between bad things and what he said. Yeah, so what? That's still within the realm. I mean, that's bad. Yeah, that's bad. I can think of worse. I can think of much worse things to say. But also, you have to combine it with like the ethics of this is so complex, and I know that no one's thinking about it to this degree. Only like I'm thinking about it to this degree. But there you have tier upon tier of paradigm shifts that you have to do depending on how the statement is being made. When you're talking about language, language is so complicated. It's what we use all the time. Usually the norms of language are not writ anywhere. They are just something you use just because people happen to interpret them the way they do. Like, it works because it does. That's the general ethical attitude towards language that I've seen in life. And as a fucking quasi-autist, that pisses me off. Because ethically, that's not how things should work. Like, language normally is just you go with the flow. Well, you go with the flow and you end up making mistakes when it comes to things that like this, where there's no proportionality, there's no accountability on the allocations of social capital and value that are being made, and like the way that the value system's being perceived as language is being used by the people who are perceiving it. What I've observed while being in university is that nobody actually gives a fuck about how they're perceiving value as language is being used. They're going with their perceptions, and that's it. And I'm the weirdo who I'm trying to come in and literally put a stop to the conversation so we can make sure that we are being fair in how we're allocating the value of things as we're perceiving that, as the language train is going by. So when it comes to the ethics, you have to consider the paradigms for this thing. For one, there has to be a difference between a targeted use of bad language versus an untargeted use of bad language. This was untargeted. He did not target anyone. It was a statement in a vacuum. Second of all, you have to take into account that it's a statement in a vacuum and not a statement done around other people. If he were saying this, although even in that case on the internet, that's the other point. If you're saying the N-word around other people, that's a whole different ballgame than if you're saying it by yourself in the middle of the woods. If you scream the N-word in the middle of the woods, and no one's around to hear you, are you still being a racist? Well, I would say it depends, but generally not necessarily at all. At the very least, from that information alone, you have nothing that you can use to glean moral character, and you have nothing you can use to determine that there's a moral problem. Otherwise, you're saying there's such a thing as victimless crimes, which is ridiculous. The next thing is you have to consider the difference between, non-active cyberspace and real space. He's not saying this to real people. He's not saying this in the real world. He's saying it in cyberspace where the rules have to be different. Like, all of these differences in paradigm require different like logical shifts in terms of how we think about the value of it, right? It's completely different if you're saying it to a real person. It's completely different if you're targeting a real person. It's completely different if you're just saying it for your own purposes by yourself, right? That may very well still be, you may still very well still be a racist by yourself in a vacuum, but you don't have enough reason to suspect that anyone is a racist just from that. And that brings me to the next form, is like, what exactly is racism, right? When it comes to language. Is racism, because the conventional rule here, and this is a conventional rule, and it's always been a conventional rule ever since forever, ever since I remember being in school, which is that being racist just means, is perceptual racism. Being racist means using racist words and doing racist things, but more often than that, but that's basically it. And yeah, I don't think that's true. I simply don't think that that's true. I don't think that that's what racism is. I think that, my understanding of this is that you can use racist words if what you want to do is create shock humor. And shock humor is not, while it's not appropriate, it's not great. It's not necessarily useful. It's not inherently bad. Shock humor does offer its own legitimate value system for the people who need it, right? Shock humor can be used as a way to vent or relieve your own anger, right? Shock humor can be used for, just shock humor, just stupid humor. And if you have a stupid sense of humor, that can appeal, right? I don't see what the inherent ethical problem with that is, assuming it's being done in a pocket dimension in cyberspace, especially in a pocket dimension in cyberspace. Although even in real space, that kind of thing should still be forgiven, generally assuming the person understands that what they're doing is really not social. I think the mistake that the social justice understanding of this has is that it's their understanding of language is they basically seem to think that the language form is inherently linked to the concept itself. So if you're ever using the language, you're already doing a bad thing. You're already creating the crime. And that's where I'm making points that's a perceptional thing only. That is only true if you believe it to be true. If you perceive it, right? In other words, it's true in it's true in the subject's mind if they project something. It's not true on its own if you don't project anything else. In other words, to explain this philosophically, it's you have the concept that the N-word refers to. You have the concept that the N-word refers to. And what is that concept? And the concept that the N-word refers to is, say, it's a black person who is inferior in some capacity. They are lower. They are, and they're not just inferior by virtue of some kind of character. This is what the anti-SJW crowd might say. They'll say things like, well, it doesn't reflect your skin color, it reflects your state of mind or your character. No. It reflects character, but it's character intrinsically tied to skin color or ethnicity. So in other words, it's it really represents the idea that one's skin color or ethnicity is inherently tied to some kind of low characterization of them. That's what the N-word represents. That's what the N-word actually means. That's the Platonic form of it. That's the conceptual form, right? Remember, the world is everything that is the case, right? So that conceptual form, that exists. That exists experientially. That concept exists. You can't remove the concept from reality. It already exists, unless we forget what it is. The N-word itself, the actual letters in the word, the symbol, that's the language form. That's the thing that... Let me see the camera. Yeah, that's the language form. That's the symbol that we use in speech to point to this concept, right? That's the language form. Now, what the left seems to... Well, not the left. What the social justice types seem to think when it comes to changing language here is that you just reduce the use of the language form and you reduce the impact of the conceptual form. And that doesn't... Well, that could work. That could work because if you reduce the language form to a point where everyone's afraid to use it and then no one knows what it is and then we forget about it, then that would work. And that's because we've forgotten what the conceptual form is because the language form has been out of use for so long. The other way to do it is to actually, this is where they won't agree, but they're wrong. You could also increase the use of the language form. You could increase it to the point where it loses all meaning. You could actually already see this in Kyle's tweets. In his first tweet, he uses the N-word 15 times. And like I said, at that point, you're hitting diminishing marginal utility. It loses meaning after you've used it enough times. And if you use it every other word, for example, you could get rid of its use. Imagine the experiment, what if everyone in the country decided to use the N-word every other word for a year? We would forget that the N-word had any bad impact at that point. If you used it for that long, if we all agreed to doing that, the N-words, the the N-word's value would disappear like that if we actually did that. Because it would be like the word "блядь" in Russian parlance. It's a rude word that they use, but they use it like every other word. You know, they'd be like "блядь" this, "блядь" that, all over again. And I'm sure for most people who use it a lot, it doesn't even have any kind of like evaluative significance. It's just like, you know, it's like Slavoj Žižek grabbing his nose and stuff. It doesn't. They just do it. It's weird, but they do it. You know, so it doesn't have any value, impacting value at that point. The point, though, is, and this is what I think the real problem, the mistake, though, is that we're still just talking about the language form. The conceptual form here, like, you have to, the conceptual form here that creates the problem doesn't ever go away, and doing something to the language form doesn't necessarily fix anything because this thing here doesn't actually go away. What they want is for this to go away, this concept to go away. And the only way this concept can go away is if we forget what the concept is. But if we forget what the concept is, that opens society up to a whole new path where it might happen again and we'd have to relearn what the concept is. We don't actually want to forget what the concept is. What we want to do is make sure that we know enough about what the concept is to make sure that the concept doesn't resurface in any kind of socially impactful way. And that's where I would say that there's an additional form over here, like some kind of value form, that's attached to the way the language form is used. So you have like the conceptual form, the language form, and then the value form that determines, right, what the language form actually means. Because it can reference this concept without actually pursuing this concept. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. This is why I think shock humor is in a different category, and using the N-word ironically and doing what Kyle did. It doesn't. It's a kind of action that is clearly, it is obviously at the expense of real racism, but it is not in the pursuit of real racism, or there is no reason to think that it's in the pursuit of real racism. And people might feel that that isn't true because they read into it. But that's what I'm saying. It feels like you're reading into it. As it stands, you need to... I guess what I'm suggesting then is that there is a way to use words to implicate hideous concepts, to make fun of those concepts, and be at the expense of those tragedies without actually pursuing those things, without actually driving for those things, whilst knowing where the line is before creating those actual things. And that needs to be respected, socially respected, as like a legitimate form of expression. Right? Not a legitimate form of external expression, but a legitimate form of expression insofar as if you do it, you shouldn't be driven underground and you know, you shouldn't have institutional access, and we're going to judge you socially because you've done that. That's what I mean. Because I'm not actually saying that the N-word should be popularized and everyone should be saying it all the time. No, absolutely not. Because that would also diminish the shock value thing. It has shock because people don't want to hear it, right? It has shock because you're not supposed to say it. That's kind of how it works. You know, its value comes from the fact that it's something you're not supposed to do. Right? And even if you do use it, there's a difference between like hard R and non-hard R. The hard R is worse because the hard R more directly references the conceptual form that people have a problem with. I guess the issue comes down to whether or not you actually think that whether you actually are cognizant of the fact that you aren't removing the conceptual form from reality, because you can't do that, because that's not how it works. Reality is everything that is the case. Reality is platonic. You can't remove it. You can perceive it a certain way. You can, you know, reference it in a certain way. You can use it, but that's all over here. That's the value form at play. That's the way it's manifesting. That's why I'm fundamentally asking the question. It's like, you know, does this have to be perceived as real racism, right? Does this have to be perceived as real racism? And for fuck's sake, I mean, the arguments be like, well, you're just a white man trying to justify being racist. It's like, no, do I have to be that in your own mind? Because you're probably reading something into my own character there. I didn't grow up in the South. I didn't grow up around racism. I grew up where there was no racism. I grew up in a world where there was no racism. In my world, no one was really racist, aside from maybe like some microaggressive thing here and there. But on the whole, there was no real, like, outwardly noticeable, grotesque racism anywhere that I noticed. Of course, maybe that's my white privilege. That's what I noticed. And of course, the only thing there was, though, was this implication that's like, yes, but racism has this impact, it has this history, so you don't use it. If you use it in school, you know, you get suspended, or you go to the office, you get reprimanded. And that seems reasonably fair. You don't say, you know, bad words that are putting people down. But the difference there, this was before informational exposure, right? You could always go home, you know, you could always like go hang out with your friends and say the bad, mean words that nobody wanted to say and nobody gives a shit, right? Because nobody hears about it, nobody knows about it, right? And you could say it in joking ways to another. And I know people who have like black friends that also engaged in that, right? So it's like that can't happen now, though, because now you have the internet where you have information exposure and everyone's up and fucking like agitated by this for some reason. Yeah, I mean, I guess like the question is more general, is like, are you allowed to have offensive humor? Like, I think offensive humor insofar as it is just offensive humor, like in the form that it is, which is on the internet, non-targeted, non-social, not surrounded by social world. If you happen to find out about something like that, that should have no implications on anything. No one should care. Like that's what I'm vying for. Is people should have heard this and be like, okay, cool. At most, the second tweet where he was talking about a CS:GO map should maybe get. At most, I would be like, okay, that's a little bit sus. I would keep my eye on you, but I'm still not going to assume that there's anything serious there. Because fundamentally, I understand the mindset that someone might have where they would want to make crazy statements for shock value and not actually mean any of them. And I do it because, well, to admit, I've done that myself. I've made offensive jokes, right? And I still make offensive jokes off camera because there is a certain like cathartic release to being able to do that. Okay, it's you're getting away from society and its norms and just being whatever and just expressing this. It's different. You don't target anyone with it, but expressing it in general seems as a general act to be totally innocent. And we have this idea, at least maybe this is an idea in the States especially, is that this is somehow this is relevant enough that we need to get people to come in and ethically fucking dissect it, which they're not even good at doing, because if you were to ethically dissect it, you'd see that there's no problem with it. It's just its own value form that's innocent by itself, operating by itself, you know, in the vestigial lands of the internet somewhere. I guess the only thing is if someone's making like death threats, or if they're making like talking about shooting up a school stuff. See, that's a little bit more understandable because, well, there actually is there is shootings happening in the States all the time. So I can understand people being more suspicious of that. Suspicious enough that it's like, ooh, you know, that's a problem. But nonetheless, I would still, even then, if we weren't in the States, if this was in Canada, because I went to school in Canada, I wouldn't care if this was in Canada. Maybe there should be a police investigation, but that's the thing. It's like there should be a police investigation. There shouldn't be institutional action, right, rather than a police investigation. Because determine what the actual truth is. Is there a real threat or not? And the police can do that. And if there actually is an ethical problem, then get the courts involved, right? There should be like an internet court at that point to resolving these kinds of disputes. Except that wouldn't work because that's too much. But that's more, again, the advantage of having a court over just the public deciding is that the public is not accountable when they make a decision. The public can be making a decision with little to no information, or their own perceptions, or their own feelings, or without impartiality. Like the public, like the good thing about democracy and public egalitarian decision making is that nobody has to fit any kind of standard in order to make the decision. But also, the bad thing about democracy is nobody has to fit any kind of standard to make a decision. The advantage of a court is that it's rigorous. You have all the information out there, you have all the information exposed, everyone can see it, everyone can touch it, everyone knows what's going on as best as they can. It's as close to rigorous as you can get for ethical decision making in society. So if that's the standard, if the tier of consequence we're going for with these people is on that level, then you need to get legality involved in some degree. Or have some kind of internet right system. Have a kind of internet rights where people on the internet can just say crazy things. Especially if they're not targeting anyone, they can say crazy things. They're targeting groups, but they're not even so they're not targeting specific groups, though. They're not targeting actual groups. They're targeting abstract groups. They're targeting conceptual groups. They're using the concept. Like I said, it's like jokes about the Holocaust. And I do realize that, there is certainly a line even with that insofar as how it reflects a person's character. Like I'm thinking, for example, what if someone in a private chat, I don't know why they did this in a Google Doc, it's fucking ridiculous, dude, that seems stupid, but what if someone decided to make a video game where you run an extermination camp? Or something crazy like that, or something, deeply, recreating some kind of sick fantasy that relates to fucked up shit humanity has done in recent history. What then? It's like, yeah, that's fucked up. There's a point where it gets fucked up. That's why I said that his second message is the only one that's sus. But the funny thing is, I can even see, even in those cases, I can still see a mindset where that's, I can still put myself in a mindset of doing that where that's still an innocent joke, if it's not targeted towards anyone. So in a fucked up way, the fucked up desires that people have, insofar as they're sufficiently private, should generally be ignored. And while I am not saying that means you don't judge their character, that does mean you don't jump to institutional action on behalf of your assessment of their character, right? And I have a video that I made about this probably years ago where I was talking about just this very concept. What if somebody made a game where you rape people, and the whole point of the game is to glorify rape? It's like, what then? Should that kind of game be... there's a separate question, which is whether or not that should be made. And the answer to that is it shouldn't be made if it doesn't have to be made. But if it has to be made, if the person is addicted to that type of content, that's still, then sure, and that's still better, and that is good enough. There's a few things going on there that I don't necessarily want to get into right now because it's complicated. But there is sort of a balance that you can achieve where you can create the fucked up content. Ethically speaking, there's a balance. You can create the fucked up content, and it's not necessarily an indicator of institutional action, but it is an indicator of, okay, I'm looking at you with some suspicion now because you're into that content, if I happen to find out about it. That's not what this is. This changes nothing if you hadn't known about it. This would have changed nothing. You know enough about the situation. If you read the Kyle Kashuv situation, I think it's ridiculous that social justice-y people are looking at this and thinking that this is a non-negligible piece of information now that we know about it. It absolutely is not. It happened that to me actually just shows that people are kind of out of touch with, I guess, the darker side of humanity's ways of expressing themselves. Because this is so mild compared to the things that a person can say and do. This is so incredibly mild that it actually should affect nothing. It actually would have affected nothing had you not known about it. There's not some deep threat in there or indication of character that would have had an impact on the world had you not known about it. It's not like he was going to start, calling people the N-word in real life. It's not like he was going to start, attacking people or doing ridiculous things. And I feel like, yeah, it's not like you had any indication that the character that was there that said those messages was then going to have a racist impact on the rest of the world had you not known about those messages. You don't have enough reason to think that that's true. Like, you have to understand, it's like, you have to consider the difference. It's like, imagine this, like, old white person sitting on the porch, you know, in southern fucking Alabama, watching black people walk by and being like, oh, you know, look at them Negroes. Versus this kid, those are two different characters. Those are very different characters. They're not the same. Like, this really does feel like just this thing that's in the United States where people get fucking crazy about everything, and it... Yeah. Now, some of you might think that after... See, I'm going to such lengths to defend, like internet buffoonery, that I'm also saying trolling is okay. No, I don't think trolling is okay. But, well, like all of these things, there is a line, right? I don't necessarily... I'll put it like this. I don't necessarily trust that other people know where the line is, right? I don't necessarily trust people like Kyle. That's why I don't necessarily feel sorry for people like Kyle. But I don't necessarily trust people like Kyle to know where the line is. I do trust myself to know where the line is. And the line, as I understand it, is basically you have to have some sense of, like, restraint when it comes to any situation where what you're saying might have a real impact. And that doesn't count when you're just on the internet, because anything on the internet can have a real impact if you... Like, again, information exposure. I'm saying in a situation where there is direct impact, that's when you have to understand that you need to... The person basically needs to demonstrate that they have the ability to show restraint in cases where it matters, compared to cases where it doesn't. Trolling is a whole different thing. There's forms of trolling that are innocent. There's forms of trolling that are contentious. There's forms of trolling that are wrong but forgivable, and then there's forms of trolling that are actually just wrong. And I've had experience with all kinds. When I was in high school, I didn't really have any friends. The only people I hung out with were people who were actual trolls. Like, actual trolls. I think one of them was a 4chan guy. And these are people who have no character. And their entire character is about being essentially malicious and nasty, either as a defense mechanism or just as some sort of, like, that's the only thing that excites them or interests them anymore, is the edginess of, and like, pushing edginess onto other people because they have nothing else. Those are different characters, though. Those are very different characters. That's not Kyle's character, not based on what happened. That being said, though, you haven't actually improved Kyle's character in this situation. He's not become a better person because of this. Not the argument hasn't made any sense. The only thing that Kyle, I imagine, has learned from this is that perception matters. Is that the way you come across in language matters, and thus you need to appear, you know, clean and scholarly and erudite and fucking sterile and all that shit. You need to have this, like, sterilized... It's form over substance, and you need to have the perfect form for society to respect you. Because that's all this is. This is a form versus substance debate, not a racism versus anti-racism debate. Yeah. Okay, now some people will say, some people who are more sensitive about racial issues will point out that maybe I'm being unsympathetic. That, look, there's black people who might care about this. And I mean, he also said kill all the Jews, and there's Jewish people who might care about that. There's people who might care about these things. Doesn't that matter? Sure, it does. But also, you know, you can care about all kinds of things. You also have a responsibility not to read your feelings into things that aren't that aren't about that, into things that aren't about you whatsoever. His statements aren't about you. They're not. It could very well be the case that they're not about you, and it could very well be the case that they wouldn't have affected you. And I would say, yes, even marginalized groups have that responsibility, not to read their feelings into all the things that might hurt them. You know, So my question, if there are, I mean, I'm curious as to if anyone who's watching this is black or is Jewish. I'm curious to see how this actually made you feel. I would be amazed if there weren't, some black people and some Jewish people who didn't care, who were like, okay, whatever, like who were not in any way impacted by this. Because, again, it might depend, because yes, obviously, if you're going to go around and you hear the N-word all the time in your life, white people call you that, that's a different story. Like, you might think that this is just another tool of your oppression and stuff, and people are using it to put you down. But even in that case, that could be a legacy problem that's due to the way that the United States' history has happened and the way things have changed and evolved over time. That still doesn't mean that there isn't a healthy divergence between actual racism and how it employs the N-word versus shock humor, shock value, offensive humor uses of the N-word, which on its own, as I'm arguing in this particular case, has an innocent form because it's not trolling and it's not targeted. If these things diverge, and if you don't think that they diverge, that itself has to be an argument, and I don't understand how we can have that, because they have to diverge. They have to diverge because they diverge in language. Like the whole value form, conceptual form thing, again. If you don't think that they diverge, what you're really doing is you're just assuming intentions on the part of anyone who's using the N-word this way. You're assuming their intentions, because if you've experienced the intentions in a certain way, you can assume the intentions in this way. And I'm saying you just can't assume their intentions like that, right? The other thing is that, I know this sounds like I'm kind of like digging into people who might have serious problems, but it's like, you can't just leverage serious problems against things that aren't the same thing when they're not the same thing. You may very well have a serious problem. That doesn't mean that it's manifesting in this particular pocket of reality. Your serious problem might be the result of something else. Your serious problem might be the result of other people who are using the N-word in an actually bad way. And that's where the problem is, not here. Those two things aren't connected. If they might be connected in the States. I mean, it may very well be that Kyle Kashuv is a huge racist as well, like inside and outside. But this is external racism rather than internal racism. And it's internal racism that's actually created the problems that I think, people who've been impacted by racism have been impacted by. One of the problems as well on this front, I mean, you can easily distinguish between uses of the N-word and things like, shooting, cops shooting black people, or, black communities having trouble, having bad schools, having bad this, bad that, or fucking, some sort of cultural bias where, if a white girl dies, it's a huge national tragedy, but a black girl dies, nobody gives a fuck. Yes, those are all legitimate issues, right? And as well, if somebody were, even this innocent form of humor that I'm arguing is innocent, even if this were, like, plastered all over reality, you'd have a problem as well, right? Unless it would get into back to the whole language thing where it's used so often that it loses meaning. But even if it was used, because this form of humor doesn't take away its meaning, it tries to use its original meaning for its own shock purpose. Even if that was plastered all over reality, yes, then you'd have a real problem, which is why I'm not in favor of that. But that's the point, is that this already isn't all over reality. It's in some corner, where it's used for a private purpose, right? The ethical fucking calculus of that has to be different. You can't just, like, assume that that's there to hurt you. I mean, I guess that's the argument. And one of the I guess the problems as well is that for the black communities, that they don't have, the N-word is it's an inherent advantage that white people have in America versus black people, is that black people don't have an N-word for white people, right? It's a word that white people can always use to put down black people. Black people can't use it. That's why black people have taken it and made it their own, so that white people can't use it, right? But that's because if white people do use it, they can put black people down. Black people can't call white people the N-word, right? It's not transferable between ethnicities, right? And there is no N-word equivalent for white people. So what do? You could try to create an N-word equivalent for white people, but that probably wouldn't work without all the, the chattel slavery and all the socio-political baggage and stuff. Nonetheless, it probably should exist to return things to balance. Otherwise, this is just an unbalanced situation where, you have this horrible word that's, one group can just use against another, and the one group can't use it back. That's not a fair situation whatsoever. In some ways, you're gonna need to find new ways for black people to be racist against white people. I know that might sound unintuitive to people. You're like, well, what the hell are you talking about? Are you saying that black people need to be more racist to white people? In a sense, yeah, because the problem isn't that. The problem isn't that racism. Well, the problem is that racism existed. The problem is not in the current status quo that. The problem is that the language is already designed and the values of it are already assigned in a way where racism can still happen very easily from one side to the next, right? Only in this one direction, right? If it could happen in this direction as well, that would even things out. But it's probably very hard to make that actually happen without, instituting racism. Even if we construct the N-word equivalent for white people and start using it, it would have to take until white people, stop procreating and or start getting marginalized for it to actually balance out. And I'm not sure that we necessarily need to go that far, but it is an important advantage to keep in mind. Nonetheless, I think the idea that you can just negate the use out of reality is ridiculous, and it ignores the legitimacy of shock humor and shock value as something that a person can do in their private time, which is why I don't think anyone should react to this. Final thing I want to mention, and this is perhaps some people disagree with me on this, but I don't actually think that this is the left's fault. I know every anti-SJW thinks it's the left's fault when it comes to political correctness, but I think it has nothing to do with the left. It just happens to be the fact that the left owns the issues relating to the left owns the issues that relate to moral and compassionate behavior when it comes to language. That is why the left has political correctness right now. It has it's not inherently a leftist thing. If it was the right, or if it was some other ideology that had, the monopoly on what the ethics of language were, you would see the same thing. Imagine that we had imagine a Renaissance type world, or a world where Christianity is seen as the mainstream way for people to be moral in their use of language. And Christians were reeling from the way that they were abused by the Romans or some other group before they came. And then you had the internet. Imagine that world. Well, in that world, heresy or anything blasphemous or anything that makes fun of the fact that Christians were persecuted by this other group would fall into the same category as this. It would work the exact same way. And if you were to do this, and if there could have been a word for that, that would have been the same thing as political correctness, pretty much, right? And violating those rules would have been political incorrectness and would have branded you as some kind of weird, asshole, jerk, psycho type person in that world, right? It's the same effect now. Now imagine you had the internet back in that world. If you had the internet back in that world, you can imagine all kinds of reputational destruction and damage that would have happened to people who got outed as blasphemers or heretics or people who made fun of Christians. Because when you have the idea that this particular thing is what's good, this particular thing is the path towards righteousness and value and compassion, and this is how everyone understands compassion, then violations of that is just inherently discompassionate. And Christianity was that at one point in history, so this would have been the same. This would have had the same kind of, I think this would have been the same dynamic if the internet somehow popped up back then. Now, things are certainly better because, reputational damage is not the same thing as, we're not killing you, we're not, castrating you, we're not cutting we're not cutting your hands off, we're not doing anything grotesque, but we are still destroying people's reputations, we are still excising them, we are still rescinding, we are still tampering with institutional behavior based off of these, perception-based assumptions. None of that seems fair. And a truly progressive society would have to get to a point where it just stops doing that. Otherwise, it's just going to be another matter of, until, when we finally get a post-racist world, there's just going to be the next thing, and then in the next thing, there's going to be the same type of problem. Yeah. And I actually, this does relate somewhat to my own ideas of what a post-racist world is supposed to look like. Which I haven't talked about, but fundamentally I don't think that a post-racist world is a world where nobody does anything that is perceptionally racist, right? Perceptional racism will always exist. Perceptional racism will still exist, right? It just won't be actual racism. The value form will not be racism. The value form will not be racism, but the conceptual form of true racism will still be referenced all the time in the form of obscenity and shock humor and things like that, And the thing is, people who've used it like that. Like you have Slavoj Žižek, he's used the N-word in 2015. I think he had an interview where he used the N-word, right? He used the N-word to discuss a situation. I mean, yes, it's different. It's not as it's not as shocking. It's not as crazy. He's repeating it in all caps, but he still used it. And then there's the YouTuber iDubbbz who says the word nigger faggot, there's things like that. You have these are all perceptual forms of the same thing, and I think that kind of obscenity and shock has to have a place in society. And when I say society, I don't mean society writ large, but in the private modes and forms of expression that individuals have. And that should not be an indication of, problems with character that merit direct institutional action or tampering, or hell, reputational action. Because even if Harvard is in their rights to fucking rescind, the problem is on top of that, there's this whole reputational effect that's happened, because now everyone's like, Kyle's a racist, and this is now going to follow him forever. The controversy is not, the controversy is just going to go to the next school. It's going to be the same kind of problem. Now this controversy is going to follow him everywhere around. Part of the reason why is we make such a big deal of it, because there's enough people who can't just see it for what it is, whether they're on the right or the left. Part of this also I'm just ranting at this point, but part of the problem as well is there's this I am fair to compare this to the Christian situation, because there is this sense of agreeability when it comes to the way you use language. You have to be a nice person, you have to be a nice guy. If you're not those things, something's wrong with you, and we get to excise you. If there's not, you get to become a pariah. And I don't think we have enough people in society that are willing to be pariahs right now. Anyway, that's pretty much all I have to say. Also, Game of Thrones Season 8 sucks. I didn't do a review of it, but it sucks. It's not worth talking about. That's pretty much all I have to say about that. So, that's it. Cheers.